Welcome back. This is part 2 of the lecture Foreign Exchange Markets. Let's look at the concept now of fixed exchange rates. In some countries, the foreign currency of the country is pegged to a currency, a major international currency, with no change in the relationship between the two. That is a fixed exchange rate. So the country is, in a sense, overriding supply and demand market factors by fixing the rate of exchange, pegging their currency at a set exchange rate to a major international currency. Some examples are the Omani Rial, which is pegged to the US dollar, the Mali CFA franc, which is pegged to the euro, and the Nepalese rupee, which is pegged to the Indian rupee. So from one of these currencies to the other, there is a maintained relationship that doesn't change. Now, if you were to exchange Nepalese rupees for US dollars, the exchange rate would be different tomorrow or next week or next year than today, because the Nepalese rupee is only pegged to the Indian rupee, which doesn't mean it's pegged to any other currency. Therefore, it doesn't mean that there is no exchange rate fluctuation from the Nepalese rupee to another currency. Just as the Indian rupee varies in relationship to the US dollar, so would the Nepalese rupee vary in relationship to the US dollar. So these pegged relationships only relate one currency to another. This doesn't mean that there is a fixed exchange between one currency and all others. There's still a floating exchange rate concept between the currency which is pegged to one other currency and that currency compared to all other currencies in the foreign exchange markets. Now let's talk about the concept of exchange rate risk. Exchange rate risk is the possibility that exchange rates change unfavorably in how they affect us in a particular transaction that involves more than one currency. So let's look at an example. A company goes to borrow 2,500 US dollars, and they're operating in Mexican pesos, probably in Mexico, but wherever they happen to be, they're operating in Mexican pesos. So let's look at how the change in exchange rates over time impacts the company. In the initial transaction, we have an exchange rate of 1 US dollar to 20 Mexican pesos. So the company takes out a loan in dollars, $2,500, which is going to need to be paid back in dollars at some point in the future. Now, based on the exchange rate of 20 to 1, the company converts $2,500 into 50,000 Mexican pesos. Company uses the pesos for whatever investment project that they have, and then the loan comes due. So what the company will do is they will, let's match the pesos numbers, they will obtain 50,000 Mexican pesos. They need to convert that to dollars. And if in the future the Mexican peso has depreciated such that relationship now is 1 US dollar equates to 22 Mexican pesos, then when the company goes to exchange 50,000 pesos, we divide by 22 to get the dollar amount of 2,273, and notice that that isn't enough to pay back the $2,500 loan. There's a shortage of $227. So that's a good example of exchange rate risk resulting in a loss to the company. Borrowing in dollars, immediately converting to Mexican pesos to use the money in Mexico, or again, theoretically anywhere, but probably in Mexico. At the time the loan is due, converting from Mexican pesos to US dollars at a less favorable rate means that we don't have enough to cover the loan. So we're going to need to get some additional pesos to pay off the loan. This has nothing to do with the interest paid on the loan. Additional payments have been made to cover whatever interest has been required from the time of the loan to the time the loan is now being paid off. That's a separate component of the transaction. We're simply noting here that we borrowed $2,500, converted it into a foreign currency, and then at the time of the due date, when we converted from the foreign currency back to US dollars, we were experiencing a loss, in this case of $227. Now, a company might want to prevent this loss or acquire protection against the risk of this loss, and that's possible with the hedge or a protective transaction in the derivatives markets. So as an example, let's look at one type of hedge derivative. Company wants to protect itself against this kind of loss. It will hedge the transaction by paying for the option to buy $2,500 at a fixed exchange rate, 20 Mexican pesos to 1 US dollar, that will expire. This is a right. This option is a right that has a temporary life. It will expire at the same date as the loan due date, which is enough time for the company. The entire point of the transaction is to protect itself from loss in exchange rate fluctuation from the time of taking out the loan to the time of repaying the loan. So as before, we see that at the date of the loan, the exchange rate between the dollar and the Mexican peso is 1 US dollar for 20 Mexican pesos. We borrow in dollars, 2,500. We convert at 20 to 1 into 50,000 pesos. We also purchase an option. The option has a fee, and that is, in this case, $80. That's determined by the market. We have the opportunity to purchase this option for $80, and we decide that we'll pay $80 for this protection, this hedge, which is the option or the right to buy dollars at a fixed exchange rate of pesos to dollars, not the obligation. If the exchange rate moves in such a way that this option doesn't help us, if there isn't a loss that we need to protect the company from, then we would simply let the option expire. We've spent the $80 on the option. That's not reversible, but we might not use the option. We're only going to use it if it will benefit us. So let's see what happens at the time the loan is due. As we saw previously, the exchange rate from dollars or between dollars and pesos has now changed. It is 1 US dollar equals 22 pesos. But we don't need to transact at that unfavorable rate. We have the option to maintain the relationship. $1 equates to 20 pesos. So we have 50,000 Mexican pesos. At the 20 to 1 rate, we can now acquire $2,500 for the 50,000 pesos. That is the same number as we originally converted to with our dollar loan. What this means is there is no shortage. The $2,500 that we've just converted to is the same amount as we originally borrowed. So I don't have any loss on the change in exchange rates. There is a fee involved, which is $80. But notice that the loss that we experienced in the slide before this one, that was a transaction without the hedge, was greater than the cost of this option, which is $80. Now, you don't know what's going to happen to exchange rates in the future. It could have been that there was no change in exchange rates. It could have been that the exchange rates moved in favor of the Mexican peso, or that the exchange rates moved in favor of the dollar and against the peso, but only to a small degree, such that $80 might have been more than we would have lost had we simply not protected the transaction and made the foreign exchange transaction at the time the loan was due. The benefit of the hedge is that at the beginning of the transaction, it allows us to fix the total cost of the transaction. When we acquire the option for $80, no matter what the future exchange rate movement, our total cost is going to be $80, no more, no less. That's the benefit of this hedge transaction. Acquiring this option fixes the cost associated with the foreign exchange component of the transaction. This concludes the lecture, Foreign Exchange Markets. Be sure to work through the exercises associated with this material, and I look forward to seeing you in class for our case study analysis.